Welcome, everyone. Now that we have 30 participants in there, I think that's a good time for us to start. I'm Chris Bell. I am here representing Point Reyes Books and our new store in Fairfax, Wayfinder Bookshop. Just wanted to let you know that we are so excited and feel so lucky to be able to bring writers of the amazing books that we have on our shelves to this Zoom platform so that despite wherever we are around the globe, we can all get together for a while and have some conversations about amazing topics that we usually read by ourselves in books. Today, you're going to meet David George Haskell. His latest book is Sounds Wild and Broken, and he was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Nonfiction, finalist for the Penn E. O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award, winner of the Acoustical Society of America's Science Communication Award. His previous books, The Forest Unseen and The Songs of the Trees, are acclaimed for their integration of lyrical writing and rich attention to the living world. In 2024, this year, the American Academy of Arts and Letters granted him an award in literature. Pick his books up, they're amazing. And our special guest today is Marcia Bjornerud. She is a professor of environmental studies and geosciences at Lawrence University. She's a contributing writer to the New Yorker, Wired, the Wall Street Journal, and the Los Angeles Times, and the author of Reading the Rocks, Timefulness, and Geopedia. Today, we're going to be here, and she's going to be discussing her latest book. There we are. Thank you, David. Turning to Stone, Discovering the Subtle Wisdom of Rocks. It's an amazing read, and there's so much more to it than even just in the first pages. So last but not least, housekeeping. I'm going to let everybody know you can use the QA feature to ask questions, and also that this will be, you will get a, if you registered, you'll get a notification when this is up on our YouTube channel. Without further ado, I give you David and Marcia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. Such a pleasure to be with you. And that perhaps in kicking things off, offer some gratitude to you, but also to Point Reyes Books, Wayfinder Books, who really do extraordinary work connecting authors and readers and connecting readers to one another. And if you haven't visited their both online store, but also their stores in town, unfortunately on the different coast than where I'm located here in Atlanta, but out in California, really extraordinary experience. I visit a lot of bookstores, a lot of independent bookstores in talking about my work. Each one is a marvel, but Point Reyes Books, when I walked in, this just felt like home. Here are all the books that I love. Here are the books that I know I will love because I've heard of them, haven't read them yet. And the best part, here are a whole series of books that the staff there have curated that I haven't yet heard of and just seem like these extraordinary jewels. So really worth your while to visit website, to visit in person these amazing bookstores, but also bookstore is too small a word, I think. Community hubs in the best sense of that word. Marcia, such a pleasure to join you here in discussing your latest book. Let me just show it again for those in the back who weren't paying attention the first time we lifted it up. So Turning to Stone, Discovering the Subtle Wisdom of Rocks. Extraordinary book. I read it 2 or 3 times now, and each time new layers emerging. It's almost like a geologic experience, right? Go in and the folds and the interweavings are really quite, I mean, I'm making light of the geologic analogy, but I really mean that. It's a book that just keeps on revealing, not about, of course, rocks, but also the relationship, our relationship to time as human beings, and how our narratives and the narratives of the earth, the living earth, integrate, interweave, are in tension with one another. And you've done such an extraordinary job doing that. So thank you for offering that to the world. And I encourage everyone on this Zoom and those watching later on YouTube to make sure you get a copy. Go to Point Reyes Books, Wayfinder Books. Go to your local library. Insist that they buy and add the book to their collections. Marcia, we mentioned in the little chat we were having before we got going that you might like to start with a reading. I don't know if there are other words you'd like to say by way of introduction to the book.
Well, I just want to chime in and underscore how wonderful Point Reyes bookstore is, and I've never been there. And we were saying in the green room how envious we were in our respective places that we don't have a store like that. So yes, thank you again, Point Reyes. But yeah, I thought I'd give a quick reading just to give people a little flavor of the text and perhaps frame this somewhat strange book that does interweave my own story with rocks as really the main protagonists. So I'll read a little bit from the prologue. Turning to Stone is the story of my deepening relationship with our rocky planet as a geologist whose career has coincided with an extraordinary period of scientific discovery. If the golden age of physics occurred in the first few decades of the 20th century, with discoveries about the structure of the atom and Einstein's insights on matter and energy, the glory days of geoscience began far more recently, are in full flower today. When I first encountered the field in the late 1970s, conceptual frameworks for understanding Earth at the planetary scale were just emerging. The theory of plate tectonics was barely a decade old. Climate science was in its infancy, and the notion of global biogeochemical cycles was new. Geology was still a collection of non-intersecting subfields: mineralogy, petrology, sedimentology, paleontology, geomorphology, with limited views of the planet and research agendas driven mainly by the hunt for fossil fuels and mineral deposits. But in the early 1980s, new instrumentation, greater computational capacity, and a shift toward systems thinking started to change the discipline. In a beautiful irony, the grimy search for coal, oil, and ores had begun to reveal a stunning view of Earth across the eons. And yet few average Earth citizens have had access to the sweeping vision of the planet through time that modern geoscience now provides. And to those who have never been taught the language of the Earth, its story seems inaccessible and irrelevant. The seductive charms of technology and capitalism, in turn, have led us to the delusion that we humans have invented the world, and that the planet is just a mute, impassive backdrop to the real action. This book is an invitation into my geocentric worldview, in which rocks are raconteurs, companions, mentors, oracles, and sources of existential reassurance. To me, rocks have distinct personalities. Each type has its own idiom. Some are extroverts, easily read and eager to share, while others are reticent and cryptic. Some are like celebrities, famous and beautiful, but of little functional importance to the world, while many that seem plain and dull are essential to the long-term stability of the planet. Each chapter in this book features a rock type that was a protagonist at a certain time in my life, from an insular girlhood in northern Wisconsin through an unlikely vocation as a geologist studying mountain building processes in remote parts of the world. With each chapter, the stories of the rocks become more complex, and my relationship with them more intimate. In sharing my small human story, I hope to convey the grander dramas embodied in Earth's pantheon of rocks, and to show how rocks, whether one ever thinks about them or not, ultimately define reality for everyone who lives on this rocky planet. Contrary to their reputation, rocks are alert, responsive, communicative. They are the force field in which we live, the infrastructure of our existence, playing central roles in the economy of the world as aquifers, architects of topography, managers of ocean chemistry, regulators of climate. They are also shapeshifters and fortune tellers. Once one becomes attuned to the language of rocks, it is obvious that Earth is vibrantly alive and speaking to us all the time. Let me introduce you to some of the rocks that have helped me understand what it means to be an Earthling.
Wonderful. Thank you. What a great setup for, I mean, I'm just, even though I've read the book, it's like, I want to hear more, I want to hear more. Your ability to bring these, well, for many people seem inert, perhaps not even in consciousness, right? Part of the background in biology, we talk about plant blindness. People don't even see all the richness of the plants around them. Rock blindness is probably even deeper sense of disconnection. that maybe there are different shades of rock, or there's sand and there's hard stuff, but beyond that, not much difference. And then what you evoke is the stories of how these rocks came to be, how they interact with one another, and then also how they've intersected with your own narrative, but also the narrative of our culture more generally. Some stories of sort of appalling exploitation and degradation of landscapes, as well as stories where people have really honored the earth with their curiosity and almost a sort of playful curiosity to discover what is this world that we're living on. I'm wondering if there are, I mean, you say that the rocks have their own personalities, their own dispositions. Some are extroverted, some are introverted. Are there a couple that you could sort of give us some examples there of rock types that really seem to have very distinctive personas that you might share with us?
Well, it's like choosing your favorite child. How can I pick just one? But well, I spent an entire summer in the Canadian Arctic, immersed in a mountain belt that was made entirely of really one rock type, and it's a kind of obscure one, but very important in the whole economy of the world. And the rock type is called turbidites, or turbidite, but they almost never happen in the singular. They're always in swarms. So let me explain what a turbidite is. As its name suggests, it's got a turbulent origin. And it's the name that we use for the deposits, the sedimentary deposits that are formed on the deep sea floor when slurries of continentally derived sediment come careening off the continental shelf in terrifying, what must be terrifying, although they've very rarely ever been witnessed by humans, very, very rapidly moving gravity-driven flows that can transport immense volumes of sediment over time. And they're really the only way that ultimately continental crust can be recycled. And so there are many angles into this. These rocks were recognized in mountain belts all over the world from the 19th century, in the Alps, in the Appalachians, in the Scottish Highlands. But no one could figure out how they formed. Again, they're very repetitive. They're layered sequences of rocks that usually start with sandstone and then grade upward into a mudstone over and over and over again, usually maybe 10 to 50 centimeter thick, but in these repetitive sequences. And most rocks, when geologists look at them, we can say, oh, there's a sandstone. We know where sandstone might form. But these turbidites, no one knew how they formed until the 20th century, when an earthquake happened off the coast of Newfoundland and telegraph cables were cut in rapid succession. There was some kind of very powerful entity that had done that, and people realized it was one of these flows that now we call a turbidity current. So anyway, I think turbidites are fascinating because they eluded our understanding for so long. We saw them in mountain belts, but had no idea that they actually originated on the deep sea floor. And then also they are the only way that continental crust can be recycled, because continents can't be subducted. They can only be eroded, but most of the eroded material just ends up being lodged on the continental shelves, which is still continental. And it's only through this rather Rube Goldbergian system of erosion, deposition on the continental shelf, and then earthquakes, often shaking sediments off the continental shelf, instigating these turbidity currents, that then continental sediments can actually perhaps take the conveyor belt down with the ocean crust and be recycled. And that ridiculous mechanism has kept the volume of continental crust about constant for about 2 billion years.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. And these are not, I mean, they're not super common rocks, right, to run into. Am I understanding that?
Well, I mean, most mountain belts that have involved continental collisions do exhume turbidites up above sea level, where then geologists crawl around and can look at them. So they're actually fairly common in most ancient and recently, the Alps, for example, are a pretty young mountain belt with their turbidites all over the Alps. Much of Eastern Italy are turbidites. So yeah, they're pretty common. But we only see them after they've been tectonically deformed. We almost never see them being deposited, and to see them in their native habitats on the seafloor, we have to drill into them. So they're rocks that have traveled.
Right. As have many of the rocks in the book. I mean, one of the things that really struck me was a sense of the dynamism, you know, as I'm not a geologist, and when I look at a rock, it seems very stationary, right? There's almost a calming kind of, this has just been this way for, and you completely blow that idea out of the water. Of course, there are rocks that don't change much over human time scales, but the magnitude and the power, and sometimes the speed at which change happens and has happened in the past, and the way that is recorded in the shapes, the arrangements, the geometry of rocks is really quite stunning, and really comes through very strongly in the book. One other part from the prologue that really struck me, that see if I can find it. Yes, you said, perhaps the most distinctive characteristic of geologic thinking is the practice of roaming freely across many scales in space and time. In doing so, we see ourselves in miniature part of a long lineage of creatures on a creative planet that's renewed itself for more than 4 billion years, while keeping an idiosyncratic diary of its activities over time in the form of rocks. So that, I mean, there's so many marvelous images in that, the idea of rocks as diaries, because of course, what do we want to do with the diary? Somebody else's diary, we want to sneak a peek, right? What was happening? And so, and luckily there's no ethical issue with peeking into the secret diaries of rocks. But the stretch of the imagination, or the space of consciousness that geologists have to be in as they're working in both space and time, and then, as you said, shifting among scales of space and time is really struck me, and particularly as a scientist who comes from a different field, where yeah, there are a molecule is a different scale than a whole rainforest. But in geology, these are magnified much more. And to discover the processes of geology, to understand how these rocks got folded, infolded, and then covered in boulders, and how all of this works, really just honestly, it pushed me to the limit of what I can imagine, because not because of the writing, but the complexity of what just 1 square mile of earth and all the different parts of the diary that have come in there. Could you talk a little bit about what that ranging freely across space and time does, both scientifically, but also how that translates out into the rest of your thinking about the world? Because your book, of course, there's a lot of geology here, but you're also talking about your own story and some about the culture that we live in. And I think that freedom of imaginative movement is quite evident in all of those.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I've come to appreciate, having taught, my day job is professor geology now for 35 years or so, to undergraduates mainly, that the real cognitive challenge is developing these habits of mind, of being able to be at a single outcrop and inductively infer what that means about this place at some time in the past, to have this imaginative capacity to understand this is representing a completely different version of the world in this place. So yeah, I think that is really one of the biggest challenges. And I think it is probably why it's very difficult for people who have not had any opportunity, because our school curricula very rarely have any kind of rigorous earth science, for people to get in the door for geology. There are plenty of rock and mineral identification guides, and that's great. But I often use the analogy that yes, you do need to be able to recognize rocks and minerals by name, and there's some pleasure in that, but that's like thinking that you are speaking a language when you just know a few vocabulary words. You also need to know the grammar and the deep syntactical structures and the history of the place where the language emerged.
Right.
And that's where, yeah, that's it. It is a complex cognitive thing, and it takes practice. But I think little by little, especially if you start in a place where you're familiar with the landscape, it starts making sense. But that's what I'm trying to do with the book, is offer people a portal into this way of thinking.
Right.
And starting from my own beginnings as someone who really never thought I was a science type at all, welcoming people in that way, that,
Right.
yeah, I wasn't predestined to do this, but I feel very fortunate that somehow I happened into a field that has just fed my imagination for decades.
Right. And do you find that sort of cognitive shift or cognitive expansion or flexibility, perhaps is another word for it, is helps understand other aspects of life, your own narrative, which is deeply woven throughout the book?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that at some point, my practice as a geoscientist became grafted onto my worldview as a human being, and in more than just an intellectual way. It really is the lens through which I see the world, and I find it, in a strange way, deeply comforting. I really know who I am as an inhabitant of the earth. I know that for many people, thinking about geologic time and how brief our human existence has been relative to the depths of geologic time can feel demeaning. But I always push back against that interpretation, because I think, to me, the message is one of continuity and durability. How wonderful to know that we are part of an unbroken chain of life that goes back at least 3.5, maybe 3.8 billion years. And that we live on a very well-tested, durable, resilient planet, not one that is potentially, not very robust. So, yeah, I find deep comfort in my understanding of our story as Earthlings.
Mm-hmm. And it's a story, correct me if I'm sort of putting words in your mouth there, but to me, it seems like a story of belonging, where so many of us feel sort of alienated from our world, whether in many different ways. And this is, I mean, quite literally a grounding in the Earth story, which seems, and you use the word sacred several times in the book here, this idea of the some sort of knowledge or connection to the sacred, whatever that is, emerges not in every single instant of looking at a rock, a slice of a rock under a microscope, or taking a field trip. But there are those particular moments where something that seems transcendent or particularly important in terms of understanding our meaning and purpose seems to shine through here. And you used the term, I'm looking through my copious notes here, but you used a couple of different, in a couple of different places, talked about that connection out to the sacred. Yes, hierophany. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Could you talk a little bit about hierophany and the sacred as it relates to this, this deep personal, intellectual, but also emotional, bodily, sensory connection to the stories of the rocks about?
Yeah, so that word hierophany is, I think it was coined by Mircea Eliade, who's a Romanian philosopher, that one of my colleagues introduced me to. And I find his thinking about our relationship with the natural world really rich and deep.
Mm-hmm.
And so his idea is that there are these sort of eternal spaces or states of mind that all human religions seek to recreate. That's the purpose of ritual, that we go back to this collective experience of unity in different ways in different religions. And his idea of hierophany is when that sacred plane briefly intersects with our temporal plane or our mundane plane of existence. And you have that feeling for a moment that you're in the presence of something very much larger. And I'm sure, you in your writing, you evoke that very much as well. And I think many scientists who spend enough time in the company of entities in nature have those kinds of experiences. It's that experience of what Iris Murdoch calls unselfing, that you really, your ego is, for the moment, not the thing that's dictating your thinking. It's the presence of these other wilder, older entities that is really shaping your experience in the moment. And to me, that's hierophany.
And if you're looking for an old story that transcends us, what better story than the rocks of the earth, right? So now, as a teacher, I know you do a lot of teaching with undergraduates and so on, and have come through PhD yourself and all the rest of publishing papers. In general, we don't really talk about that much. Certainly in a professional context, if we're just attend a scientific conference and start talking about the sacred and the transcendent, there would be, at least in my field, some pushback, to say the least. More derision, I think, would be more what I would expect. Not because everyone in the room is necessarily completely hostile to the idea of the sacred, but there's this, particularly in Western science, there's been a tradition of trying to separate the quote unquote objective study of the material biologic reality of quote unquote reality of the world from questions about the sacred and about meaning, and associated with that with ethics. And that boundary, of course, in our own lives, we often find that boundary is absurd. The human existence is not divided into those two camps. The scientific practice is certainly never fully objective. How can we answer ethical questions without understanding material reality? And if we're just studying material reality, why? There's a big unanswered why behind all of that sort of very reductionist science. And you do, I think, a very interesting and careful job of interweaving these. In the book is not about go out and find a rock and you're going to have a huge mystical experience and that will answer all your questions. There's a lot of mystery, and I sense also a lot of questioning behind some of the stories of your own life. What did this particular event mean? And in hindsight, we can construct narratives about that. But what has been your experience, I mean, as a practicing scientist and teacher, but then also as a writer, where you can, in a nonfiction book like this, it's not peer-reviewed in the sense that a scientific paper would be peer-reviewed. You can put things together and weave in ways that perhaps feel more honest or more risky, or I mean, how do you feel about that?
So yeah, lots of thoughts. First of all, I think it's interesting to me that in the geosciences, in the 3 or 4 decades that I've been in the field, there has been a really profound change in the meta-narrative or something of scientific papers. Let me explain. So I remember as an undergraduate, textbooks kind of emphasizing that Earth was just, a small kind of mediocre planet in a tiny solar system around a middle-sized star, and that, the triviality of the Earth. And I would say that really has changed. I mean, I was just reading recently, Journal of Geophysical Research, a paper on what it takes really for a planet to develop a plate tectonic system. So now, we have, I don't know, I lose count, like at least 6,500 known exoplanets, of which a small fraction are rocky and an even smaller fraction are Earth-like. So they're kind of thinking how many of these might have plate tectonic systems. And really, it takes such an odd combination of planetary size. You need water, you need all kinds of particular phase changes to happen at certain depths in the mantle to have the kind of functioning plate tectonic system that we have. And they concluded that plate tectonics is a really bizarre thing. And although they did not say Earth is a sacred planet, in this very technical paper, the message was, this is a remarkable place at a cosmic scale. And so I think that, it's there. I think we need rules about the kind of writing that's appropriate in scientific journals. And, there are other kinds of ways of writing about nature. And I think we do need probably those rules, but I'm really heartened to see that I think scientists are feeling freer in my field these days to express awe, at least, or reverence, I suppose, amazement that this is a kind of bizarre planet. Then just, the whole question of objectivity. I'm not about to overturn Enlightenment practice and thinking. I am a scientist and I value the scientific way of seeing the world. But I've always felt that the posture of objectivity is just that. I mean, we can never be fully objective. We can try to minimize the biases we're bringing, but I think it's almost as bad to a priori assume that we have nothing in common with the natural world and absolutely forbid ourselves from seeing resonances with the natural world as it is to be, supposedly really objective about it. So I think we'll be missing things about the natural world if we say I'm unlike this thing completely. I'm not going to anthropomorphize it at all. And, obviously anthropomorphization is dangerous because we are just one instantiation of the creativity of nature. We aren't the template that we should apply to everything, but we're children of nature. So of course we see resonances with other things in nature. They're our cousins. Right. So, yeah, and I think most natural scientists, certainly biologists like you, geologists, we wouldn't do what we do if we didn't love the things we study, and that's okay. We're much more attuned and attentive to them because we have some kind of personal, intimate relationship with them.
Right. And that perhaps that tension between kinship and difference is one of the things that keeps things interesting, right? So obviously we're not rocks and human beings, we're obviously not chimpanzees and bonobos either, our closest relations. So there's always difference, there's diversity, but also kinship. And how that comes to be and how that plays out seems to me, at least, to be one of the things that is most fascinating. And then, of course, it plays out in human culture and human person. I mean, no two people are the same. So that tension between unity and diversity is something that I think animates the curiosity and the fascination and the love for many scientists, and also people who aren't professional scientists, but just and often know more than the people who are actually teaching the course in ecology and so on, because they've devoted their life to the study of a particular part of their state or their backyard, and really understanding gardeners and foresters and hunters and others really have an intimate knowledge that often surpasses or at least parallels that.
Yeah, and that absolutely true. People who have really bodily experienced a place over time. And I think that's one thing, especially in my field. I'm a structural geologist. I study mountain building processes, usually looking at mountains that have been eroded to the point where we can kind of see inside their guts. But working in these places, you are in this bodily relationship with what you're studying. And it is not simply an intellectual endeavor. You're really, you feel the difference between yourself and the mountain, right. But you're also with the mountain in its presence. And so that intimacy that comes from the physical engagement with it, I think, is distinctive.
Great. And I gotta say, your writing really brings that embodiment to the fore. I mean, right from the get-go, when you're talking about being young kid in the sand in your socks. I mean, maybe I'm remembering the example slightly incorrectly. And so we have that sense of bodily connection to what it's like to be with these various kinds of rocks in their various forms. And some of that is physical discomfort, cold, sleeping in cold sleeping bags with companions whose company gets old after a while on a field camp, through to an amazing sense of wonder and also terror. I mean, living through earthquakes, where you thought as a geologist, oh, I've got an intellectual understanding of an earthquake, and then you live through it. And this was a terrible earthquake that killed a lot of people in Italy. And we're there, right there with you, feeling that terror and I mean, in the sort of old school 19th century sense of the sublime, these processes that are horrific and sort of beautiful but also extraordinarily destructive. So we wouldn't use beauty in a superficial sense to describe them. Can you talk a bit about I mean, we're here talking about the book, about the writing process, about how you bring that embodiment, that connection to often very complex scientific ideas to the page, because this book is absolutely not a textbook, like we're going to just explain everything ABC. How did you approach that?
Well, it took me a long time to make peace with the memoirish format. I'd wanted to write a book that really took the reader into a deeper understanding of how the planet works. So, I mean, in my earlier books, I'd given glimpses of this, but it's not just the stories of the past. It's each of these rocks is also part of the whole physiology of the way the planet works over long periods of time. And so that was really my intent with the book. And I had a number of false starts. They started feeling pretty textbooky. And an editor that I hadn't worked with before actually contacted me out of the blue and said, have you ever considered a memoir? And my reaction was like, no way. I'm a pretty private person. We've met before, and I don't know, you have a sense of me. And I just couldn't think that was what I wanted to do.
Right.
So I sat on that for a good 2 years, and wrote a little fluffy confection of a book, Geopedia, during the COVID time, and then came back to
wonderful book, by the way.
It's a chocolate box. You can
right.
pick little pieces up, and yeah. And I guess in writing that, I kind of realized I could use stories of my own work in a way that didn't feel like, a tell-all or something, or I was really more concerned with other people's privacy. They didn't ask to have their stories told. So I started thinking I could use my own small human story as the scaffolding. And again, this kind of welcoming people in. How do you start thinking like a geologist? How over time do you develop a deeper sense of the planet's habits and culture? And initially, as you know, publishers often don't like authors' titles. Have you had that experience?
Once or twice.
Yeah. My working title was Education of an Earthling.
That's great.
So the idea being, how have I learned who we are, not just me, but just this deepening understanding and the experience of growing older. So once I made peace with it's kind of a memoir, then I could get going. And I realized, rocks really have been protagonists in my life. It's kind of sad, but true. I've had many conversations. They're not always the most vivacious interlocutors, but I feel like there's a dialogue going on. So, and in some ways that was quite natural. And I have been lucky to have lots of interesting characters I've worked with in the field from various countries around the world. And so I thought by bringing those field-based stories to life, people would feel that they were part of the conversations that we're having about what the rocks mean.
Right. Well, and I don't know if it's the bounce. I think a weave is a better word for this. The way you include some strands of your own narrative with these questions about geology really brings them to vivid life. And those of you who have not yet seen it, Catherine Schultz's piece in the New Yorker about Marcia in her book really has some interesting insights about that, about how much personal information to share or not to share, and what that reveals about the personality of the writer, and it's all good. I mean, the rocks in the story are all shining through really beautifully. So congratulations on that coverage in the New Yorker. So I wonder if we could talk about a couple of other language related things. One of the things that I know this from when we've spent a little bit of time together in the field, but also just from the book, is you have a fascination with if you like, the geology of words. So in other words, the etymology, where words come from, and what they reveal about the history of science or our relation to the land. I mean, every word has a different backstory, if you like, but the words themselves, which often, students were memorizing all this terminology, and it can feel like a game, but also sort of arbitrary. Okay, this word goes with this, and you show that absolutely not arbitrary, that each one of these words in geology and beyond has a very specific history, and the names themselves reveal a lot. And I'm wondering if there are a couple of geologic terms you could excavate for us. I mean, I've got a couple of examples written here, but if you've got some that you would like to share, that would.
Well, I can think of some, but yeah, if there were some particular ones you picked out. I mean, mineral names are just this wonderful, incredibly eclectic collection of words, some from, classical antiquity times, others, Jim Thompsonite is a mineral.
Right.
Some are kind of neologisms created from Greek roots. It's completely unsystematic and beautiful because of that, but also, it makes learning mineral names terrible for students. Amethyst is one of my favorites, and students always like this. It's the purple variety of quartz that has a certain amount of iron in it. And it comes from a Greek word, and I think it's been called this for thousands of years, not drunken. Because the methyl, the idea was that somehow if you had an amethyst crystal in your pocket, you could just drink wine and you would not become drunken. It seems like that's kind of easily tested empirically. Right.
Well, it would be a fun experiment. I mean, I think it's an experiment that demands lots of replication. Right?
Yes. But they're words from all over the world, and I love the sort of magpie nature of the geologic lexicon. We like that word, and there are words that are very specific to certain landscapes. So Jökulhlaup is one of my favorites. It's a Icelandic word that means a flood that is caused when an ice dam breaks. In Iceland, it often happens because a volcano has erupted under a glacier or something, but it's used more generally for the sudden bursting out of impounded glacial meltwaters, and creating just dramatically changed landscapes in a matter of days. So many of these honor the fact that different cultures have had different kinds of experiences geologically, and so we use the words that come from those cultures, globally.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, I would imagine my experience of learning sort of biological terms is knowing the story and the history actually makes it easier to remember, and because it's meaningful to me rather than an arbitrary sound or string of letters. That I'll know this, I'll never look at amethyst in the same way again, because of that connection, and thinking back to the people thousands of years ago who coined that term, and the richness of human interconnection and the continuity of ideas that comes through in this.
And I was just going to say that, just the sheer number of things that need names is one of it reflects the creativity of the planet. That, I sometimes joke with students that, well, if you were on Mars, for example, with certain billionaire colonists, then you wouldn't have to learn so many rock and mineral names because they're just, that planet has not generated nearly the diversity of rocks and minerals that our planet has. And people don't, I think, appreciate this, that we know from the moon rocks, and we have a pretty good sampling of various parts of the moon from the Apollo missions, but there are perhaps, depending on how you count, maybe 5 rock types and at the most 300 minerals on the moon.
Wow.
On Earth, I mean, it's just hard to know even how to count different rock types. There's a whole spectrum, thousands, and there are something on the order of 10,000 well-defined, distinct minerals. And that reflects just this creativity, the inventiveness of the planet, combining and recombining the same raw ingredients that all of the rocky planets had, but in different ways, thanks to life and water and oxygen. And
Wonderful.
So there are a lot of names because there are a lot of things.
Yeah, that's great. It's a reflection of the multitude of different entities, but also processes that produce those
Absolutely.
entities. For people who are watching, there's a Q&A box, and so we're going to talk for a little bit longer here, but then we'll open things up to Q&A. And I know Marcia and I are both eager to hear your thoughts, questions, engage in a little dialogue here. There was another aspect of language that, so you grew up in northern Wisconsin. You share some of how that affected your worldview, including your geologic worldview, and then you had of Norwegian descent, and then had some time living in Norway, doing research and living there with your kids for a while. And there were some particular Norwegian words that you claimed sort of came, you thought the language comes from the landscape itself in a way, so that the rocks and then the landscape, which also includes living beings, then in a way determine or at least shape the way people speak to one another, or the way the culture is. And I wonder if you could address that just a little bit about the tall poppies and the freedom to roam, not just intellectually, but physically, and how that sort of contrasts with perhaps sort of mainstream North American culture.
Yeah, well, my Norwegian ancestors left because there were way too many people living in a very rocky place in the 19th century. And they were all farmers and fishermen, and there just wasn't enough room. So they came to the new land and, found huge open spaces that were flat. So yeah, if people familiar with Norway, there are a few fertile valleys where agriculture is possible, but much of the country is naked rock and steep, precipitous fjords. And, there's just no question. Obviously, nature is in control. It's dark most of the, all winter, and, the weather is pretty extreme. And so there is just no illusion that we are in charge. And I think that shapes the psyche of, the Scandinavians broadly, that it's just, there's humility that stems from living in a place where nature looms so large.
Right.
And Norway has been lucky, of course. There's a kind of contradiction at the heart of Norwegian care for nature. They are a petro economy, or have been. Norway was a very poor country until the mid 60s, when offshore oil drilling suddenly made them a very wealthy country.
Right.
And they have the luxury of supporting a social democracy in a really healthy way that we don't have, largely because of oil. On the other hand, they're very, environmentally conscious and are at the forefront of trying to find carbon sequestration and green energy options. But there is kind of an intrinsic contradiction there that I find interesting as someone who's kind of partly insider, but also outsider there. But it's a small, homogeneous country. It's much easier to manage a country where you have, basically strong cultural ties that go back centuries and are not Norway's becoming more diverse, but it's still, pretty homogeneous.
Right.
So, I mean, it was very interesting for me to, again, go from my Minnesota, Wisconsin upbringing, where the old country was this much revered thing, and really experience modern Norway, that is a wonderful place too. But to compare those two versions of that place, and then experience it as a scientist too, and Svalbard in particular, which is not normal Norway. I mean,
Right.
it's there are no native inhabitants there, and it's been kind of a political pawn between the Norwegians and the Russians for a long time. So that's another layer of interesting Norwegian nationalism.
Right. Great, thank you. I'm seeing some questions here, and some of these resonate with some of the things that I have written here. So I'm wondering, I'll sort of read some of these out and maybe add a couple things. So John is asking, I'm curious how in your classes you help students expand their imaginations. What specifically does that look like? And I guess I would add, just for all of us, what are some things that you might suggest that we could do to turn to stone, to understand some of that wisdom in rocks when we're coming from a place of not knowing that much? So sort of a question specifically about the practices you do with your students, and then the more general one.
Yeah, for the intro classes, most of the students taking that class, frankly, were like I was as a first year student. I was taking it strictly to check off a box for lab science. And so I've really changed my philosophy in introductory classes from feeling compelled to do an exhaustive coverage of all the topics in the textbook to saying these are earthlings who need to know something about the way the planet works. If we don't cover all the topics, that's just fine. But if they develop those habits of mind that allow them to start thinking across timescales, developing this, what I call a sense of temporal proportion, like how long does it take for an ocean to open versus how quickly can climate change? How long does it take for groundwater to flow a mile or something like that? Developing this kind of visceral feeling for the timescales of natural processes. That to me is more important. And the best way to do that is in the field, I think, where people are learning through all their senses. And, again, bodily experiencing the landscape and trying to develop learning to filter out noise and learning to what is the real text here. Maybe if I could give a very specific example that I often do on the very first day or the first lab field trip for the intro class. We drive out of town over a pretty flat landscape, maybe half an hour drive, and we end up in this marshy area. We're walking along a dirt road, and then all of a sudden there's a hill that's rising out of this marsh, and we clamber up this hill, and it's hard to get up because it's sand and gravel, and if they're paying attention, they'll notice that it's actually layered by size. So like there's some sand, and then there's a layer of pebbles and sand, and then maybe boulders even. So, 2 steps up, 1 step back kind of thing. Get to the top, and they can see that it's like an S shape. So it's a hill in a marshy area that looks kind of like a river, but it's a hill. And I just like, okay, figure this out. I don't, they've not really had any lectures yet. And, people know that we had glaciers here. So they think, well, could a glacier have left it? Well, maybe glaciers are involved. We see that these rocks are like many different types, probably gathered from different places, but glaciers don't sort things by size. And why would it be this weird shape? And they get aggravated, and I just let them think about it.
Yeah.
And finally, and then someone says, well, it does look like a river, and rivers could do this. If the velocity of the water was fluctuating, you could get sand and then cobbles and pebbles. And then someone says, could it have been a river under a glacier? The river
Yeah,
was
yeah.
a river, but the valley of the river is gone because it's melted away long
Mhm.
ago. And now we're left with this beautiful thing we call an esker. And, that is the moment where they think, we figured that out from first principles. They didn't need to really know anything else. They just had to listen to this thing.
Mhm.
And honestly, by the end of that, on many people, it's a place, it's a sand and gravel pit, actually, and people are just incensed. They can't believe that this thing is being excavated for road
Right.
building materials.
Right.
So they've made some kind of connection,
Mhm.
and then they trust their own ability to make those sorts of inferences. So for people who haven't had the opportunity, because sadly, I mean, it really is a tragedy to me that our high school curricula do not represent, in most cases, maybe California is more enlightened, but in most places, if earth science is in the schools, it's considered a lesser science, not for the college-bound kids.
Mhm.
No AP class in geoscience. And that's a complete artifact of the relatively late development of the geosciences compared with physics and chemistry and biology in the schools. So sadly, the one science that most earthlings really need, they
Yeah.
have no exposure to it. So
Mhm.
what can we do? There are many great books. I have some on my shelves that are part of, they're called Roadside Geology of Georgia or Wisconsin or California. Um, and there's a parallel series that are called something like Geology Underfoot in. And those tend to be quite good. They're written by professional geologists who are good science communicators. And that's a good way to start because they start with parks and familiar public spaces and tell the
Mhm.
stories of these places and then introduce some vocabulary along the way. And I think they're, yeah, starting with something like that. Most states have geological surveys that have
Mhm.
free maps, potentially, non-technical guides to parks and things like that.
Right.
There are
And
local
of course,
groups.
there's this book too, which is a great way of putting things into into context. Well, thank you. And your students are extraordinarily lucky to be able to have you as their guide, as sort of a mentor to take them to these places and give them the right kind of challenges. And I can imagine those students will never again. I mean, it's about that particular set of the sand and the gravel, but also just an expansion of the imagination that, wow, we're standing on what was a river that used to be under a glacier. I mean, that in and of itself, figuring that out is for me at least, is a shocking realization.
Yeah, I mean, it's hierophany. And again, that's what I hope they take away, even if they don't remember some of the details, that, ooh,
Mhm.
there are different versions of the world and they're accessible to us, that we can
Mhm.
have a glimpse of them. And they're still with us in some way.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there is an irony in that. I mean, the U.S. is pretty dependent on geologists for the foundation of our fossil fuel based economy and our material economy. And yet in high schools, we learn almost, I mean, and even in colleges, it's many students go through and really don't learn much, if anything at all, except for some, I mean, I'm lucky to be at a university. It has a great geology program. And so but I know that's not the case everywhere. So another question, this is sort of a somewhat different track from Tara on the Q&A, who's curious to hear about some of your specific experiences as rocks as a living. She says, I think I understand it very generally, but would love to hear it in a story form. And I should point out, at the end of the book, you talk about the earth as sort of hyperconscious, which implies a sort of living. And at the very beginning, you said it took you 30 years to say it out loud that these rocks are animate in some way. So this is a theme that's you start the book here, you end the book here, and it threads through. I'm wondering if you could sort of elaborate that a little for us.
Yeah, so that's a little dangerous for scientists to assert, but certainly rocks are animate. They are moving around, and the plates are moving, mountains are growing, rocks are folding. In my field, that's what we do. We model rock deformation and we treat rocks as fluids, viscous fluids that are moving. So they're animate for sure. The living part is harder. And, famously in the 1980s, James Lovelock proposed the Gaia hypothesis, which asserted that in some sense, Earth is a living superorganism. And that idea, in much of the core of that way of thinking, has actually made it into mainstream geoscience now under the guise of biogeochemistry. The biogeochemical cycles, even if Earth itself is not an organism, surely the solid Earth and the biosphere are so intimately wrapped up with each other. There's no bright line. And what I'm trying to convey with this book is that, okay, there's the biochemistry kind of short carbon cycle kinds of things, but then there are these really long-term tectonic cycles that the solid Earth is undergoing as well, in a, I don't know, cyborgic almost like way, that have maintained stability over the long haul, particularly subduction, which is the Earth's signature tectonic practice of recycling ocean crust that carries water back into the mantle. So the atmosphere hydrosphere system remains in contact with the deep interior of the Earth. And there's probably at least one ocean's worth of water in the mantle. If that weren't true, little by little, the water would be outgassed, and the mantle would actually become too viscous to convect. And so then plate tectonics wouldn't happen. And so it's this self-perpetuating thing that is like a living thing. And then the consciousness thing, I was asked to give a talk at a conference on consciousness a couple of years ago. And I started reading literature about what exactly we mean by consciousness, and no one can agree. And, of course, human consciousness is just maybe one subset of all the possible spectrum of types of consciousness. But one definition, somebody actually at the University of Wisconsin has advocated, is a system that is connected at many scales and has just many, 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 many points of connection. And, if that's the definition we want to use, then yeah, Earth is definitely conscious, because all of these parts are intimately connected at different scales and across time. I mean, that's the even more extraordinary thing, that we can have rocks of vastly different ages juxtaposed next to each other, communicating in real time with the atmosphere of today. So, I mean, if you use that connectivity, and it's a more technical definition than I've conveyed, but then, the number of nodes of connectivity, then yeah, Earth surely is way more complex than the human brain is. I've never understood where that assertion that the human brain is the most complex thing in the universe, who came up with that? We're just part of this much larger system. So
well, the human brain is pretty impressively connected, but one handful of forest soil has as many interconnected living organisms as there are cells in the human brain interconnected. So just in a little piece of forest soil, there's a lot going on there. I think that and you don't address, I think, wisely in the book, the question of sort of subjective experience, because often when people hear consciousness, I mean, another definition of consciousness is subjective experience that is, at least among humans, so far unexplained, right? Where does this personal, private, subjective experience actually emerge from? And there's always a temptation to say, well, let's project the humanoid experience of consciousness out into the world. And I just want to make clear for listeners that is not what you're arguing in this book, that we're surrounded by little sort of human brains. And
no, not at all. And I would point out, this is kind of a bleak point of view, that our particular version of consciousness has not yet been proven to be an evolutionary long-term advantage. It could be a liability that doesn't persist in the long term.
Depends what part of the news cycle we're in, whether it's an advantage or not. So another question was about epistemology of geology. And you've talked a little bit about the expansion of consciousness and the flexibility sort of cognitive processes. Are there other aspects of sort of the epistemology of geology that you could sort of flesh out a little bit for us, or stone out? I mean, I keep using biological like metaphors. Forget this flesh, let's have some stone.
Crystallize out.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, kind of the foundational principle is uniformitarianism, which was articulated in the 19th century, well, late 18th, early 19th century. And the idea was a break from supernatural explanations for geologic phenomena. So well into the 18th century, even people who, they weren't using the word geologist, but people who were thinking about geologic phenomena were looking in the West to the Bible for explanations of things like the Grand Canyon. And generally, cataclysms like Noah's flood especially were invoked as the explanation for having deep canyons or finding seashells on the sides of mountains. And so the counterpoint to that was this very simple idea, long name, uniformitarianism, that the present is the key to the past, that we should look to the world of today for how to explain landscapes and rocks and people. In the most orthodox version of uniformitarianism, it was taboo to invoke anything that was catastrophic or sudden. It became this kind of orthodoxy in the 19th century that uniformitarianism was gradualism. So you did not invoke big, violent events when you could have raindrops slowly eroding mountains. And that was a blinkering point of view, really up right until 1980, when famously Walter Alvarez, who's a geologist, and Luis Alvarez, his father, who was a physicist, proposed that the dinosaur extinction event was caused by a meteorite impact. That was very, very unpalatable to most geologists at the time. And it was based on the observation of a trace element in rocks in Italy, and they didn't know where the crater was. It took 10 years till the crater was located. But that was a huge, huge change in the philosophy of geology, that, okay, uniformitarianism doesn't mean that catastrophic things don't happen, but you need to be careful in invoking these. So, I mean, it's really interesting. There was almost a pent up number of really catastrophic explanations for geologic phenomena in the years after finally the crater in the Yucatan was discovered, and most people accepted that, yes, sometimes Earth gets hit by space rocks. There were lots of big, sort of high amplitude things proposed. It was like people were just waiting. And now the pendulum, I think people have become, there's a better sense of criteria for accepting when such explanations are acceptable or not. Yeah.
In your discussion of that particular sort of part of sort of intellectual history, you mentioned some more recent hypotheses about the Siberian traps and others, and also the role that gender played in how people accept or reject or are hostile to particular ideas. And that's a set of questions and experiences that occur regularly through your book as a woman coming into a field that was, certainly back when you were a student, almost entirely dominated by men, field trips with no restroom breaks except for the guys who wanted to pee off by themselves. I mean, just one example after another of these perhaps micro aggressions, but also much more macro things. I know that's a very big topic, but I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit on how you see the issue of gender in terms of how the field of geology is evolving, and also how the sort of idea of the epistemology of geology, how hypotheses are put out there, but they come from particular people who have who are gendered and who are in particular locations in the world, all sorts of ways in which we're different. I'm wondering.
Yeah, happily, geoscience now is a much more diverse field than it was, gender and just demographic representation broadly. I mean, in my own classes now, I have more women students than men. But it's been a long time coming. When I first started publishing papers, I never used my full first name. I was just initials, because I felt that was a liability at the time. I kind of hid behind initials. And it was referenced specifically to the whole dinosaur extinction event. I don't know, dinosaurs just inflame people's brains in ways I don't fully understand. I don't really have skin in the game. But I find that just the viciousness of that conversation fascinating. What is it really about? And I do read gender into it. There's the Alvarez camp, and then the main person who's been challenging the idea that it was only an asteroid impact is Gerda Keller at Princeton. And she's a difficult person. She's she's not a pushover. And it's fascinating to me to just like, why is this so intractable? And I really don't think that we're going to have a full understanding of that extinction event until all of those players are sort of off the stage. And we can all have a calm, because even trying to get their papers reviewed, people are either in one camp or the other. And it's really sad. Science has really been compromised by that. So it's interesting to me, what is at stake there? I'm not sure. But more generally, I mean, I think, why is it important to have different kinds of people doing science? Because people do bring their life experiences to some degree into the way they see the world. And the more eyes that we have, the more things we'll think about differently. And so, happily, I think most of the sciences have become much more open to different life experiences and are better for it as disciplines because of that.
Right. And another hesitation we might add to the whole idea of scientific objectivity, right? So if in the supposed dispassionate analysis of data that we can perceive very obvious personality, gender differences, power asymmetries playing out, then of course the notion of science is purely objective pursuit is just completely indefensible. It doesn't mean that it's all just arbitrary and nonsense, but it does mean that those asymmetries are very important. There are other comments here. This is not a question, but word of thanks. Thank you for witnessing the aliveness of rocks and sharing their awesomeness. Can't wait to read your book. Another person, John, a shout out to Bram Pott, who's actually a colleague of mine at Swanee, who introduced hundreds of students to the wonders of geology. Lots of good geology professors out there, expanding minds, and asking, when you mention undergrads, do you show them a peek through the door? I'm wondering what you. So of course, in geology, there's a sense of, well, in all education, there are facts, there are processes of discovery that you've described with your. I want to go on that field trip, except I now know the answer, right? Going up to the thing. What else do you hope for, particularly for students who are feeling beaten down by the news of environmental destruction and human conflict? That's all around us now. As a professor who has the opportunity to offer visions of how the world is, how the world might be, what are some of your hopes for your role as a teacher? And I think some of those, I would regard this book actually as an extension of teaching in a way, in that your gift to connect with people and to share stories really shines through here. And the book is not overtly sort of an environmental screed, save this or do that, but your love of and your deep distress at the destruction that is happening in some parts of the world is very evident.
Well, I guess I hope in my teaching and in my writing to liberate people from human narcissism, both personal and, species level, thinking that we are the story and the center of everything. And I think it is really one of the central pathologies of our time, especially with, just capitalism running rampant and social media dictating the way so many people perceive the world. And so for students, I think there many, we have basically an 18 to 22-year-old undergraduate population. They're not at the stage of their lives where they're thinking about deep existential questions. I think people are more receptive to that later in their lives. And I've done a fair number of, week-long elder hostel and field trips actually with older populations of people. And often people are much more receptive to that. What does this mean for us than students are? But students often are very hungry for something that does take them out of this noise and fray of the social media world, something that is quieter and more enduring. And there I find, they're receptive, and certainly understanding how climate change, how environmental change more broadly has happened in the past does put into perspective what we're doing. It's not, we're not wrecking the world. We're endangering ourselves and creating lots of human problems. The world is a dynamic place, and the illusion that the earth has reached its final state or something is part of our problem. So I think that students are receptive to this shift in perspective, to the zooming out and seeing ourselves in miniature and understanding the longer view, but seeing that it is relevant to making policy and making change. And I think it's a different rhetoric than the rhetoric of damage or death. We are changing. We are actually unleashing very powerful natural forces. That's what I think the message should be. We are bringing a lot of ecosystems down with us, but it's not that we are weakening the earth. We are actually going to have to contend with some things that have been in a kind of stable state for much of the Holocene. And so I think students are receptive to just a different way of thinking about these problems. They've grown up entirely in a world with climate change looming over everybody's head like a dark cloud. And so, yeah.
It seems you also are framing it just in our conversation here today, but also in the book, the sense of reframing, in terms of a sense of wonder and gratitude to be in this marvelous world. Yes, of course there are problems, there are injustices, there are huge forces we're unleashing, and yet at the same time we're in this place that is extraordinarily generative of human curiosity, and also then that is the foundation for love, for belonging to a place, which is, at least in many of my students, I sense that hunger for wanting a place to belong, which for our ancestors would have been a weird thing, right? I mean, you did nothing but belong to your place and often dreamed of escaping it. But now, of course, many of us are so disrooted, dislocated, that a sense of belonging on
We're all home here on Earth. So.
That's beautiful. Well, I think that's an extraordinary way to end. We are all home. Thank you for that thought. Are there any other concluding thoughts or reflections you want to offer before we close?
Well, I'm sure everybody heard about the news that the Stonehenge altar stone had come from Orkney all the way down to the Salisbury Plains. And I just thought, we used to be more attuned to stone and their messages. I would love to know what that old red sandstone from Orkney meant to the people. Went to the incredible effort to transport it that far. So turning to stone is a very ancient human habit.
It is. Oh, thank you, Marcia, for spending some of your evening with us all. This is the book that you should all run out now to buy from Point Reyes Books, Turning to Stone, Discovering the Subtle Wisdom of Rocks. I highly, highly recommend it. I'm going to be giving this book to a lot of people as the giving season approaches. Thank you so much for sharing all your insights in this book and for taking time with us. And thank you to Point Raised Books, of course, and to providing this forum for conversation. So thank you.